Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, we ask you to turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David McCormick.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Zackheim, director of the Reagan Institute, which is the home of the Reagan Foundation in Washington, D.C. We're just across Lafayette Park from the White House, and so I hope when you next visit our nation's capital, you'll come by and say hello to us at the Institute. Now, as we do at all Reagan Foundation events, please stand and join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. Well, thank you all for coming, and before I introduce our speaker, I do want to acknowledge the co-author of this book is in the audience, although we didn't give him a chair, James Cunningham in the back. Welcome, James. It's great to have you here. Now, 40 years ago last week, President Reagan delivered what most of us now know as the Evil Empire speech. In that speech, he laid out in stark but honest terms what was at stake in the rivalry between the world's two superpowers. He urged the audience in the room that day to, quote, "Beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil," end quote. President Reagan was doing more than denouncing the Soviet Union for what it really was. He was also reminding us that America is great because America is good. He was showing us the way to win the Cold War. And America prevailed in that struggle because of President Reagan's leadership. But how do we ensure we're up to the challenges of this decade? That's not an easy question. But if you want a thoughtful answer, then you want to ask someone like our speaker tonight. You want to hear from someone who's a proven leader, a public servant, a combat veteran. You'd want to ask someone who understands national security, who served in places like the National Security Council and the Commerce Department, and had roles like the United States Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs. You'd want insight from someone who has leadership experience as a CEO and as an Army officer, and a PhD from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs certainly doesn't hurt. In other words, you'd want guidance from someone like David McCormick, who has done all this and more. His new book is called Superpower and Peril, A Battle Plan to Renew America. It was just released 2 days ago. And we love it when people come to Reagan Library as one of their first stops on their book tour, so thank you. This book is a map for the path forward in a time when America is being challenged by China, by Russia, and by crises at home. It's a call to action to commit to ourselves to renewal. It's a reminder that America can be great as long as America is good. And on that point, we know President Reagan would agree. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a great friend of the Reagan Library, David McCormick. Well, Dave, welcome. It's great to have you here at the Reagan Library. Congratulations on the book. Superpower and Peril, a battle plan to renew America. You were running for the Senate. You were CEO of Bridgewater. When did you write this book? I feel like it came out right afterwards.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. It's really just an honor to be here. And just sort of when you walk through the halls and you think about Ronald Reagan and that legacy, you just think about leadership and the exceptionalism of America. So it's really an honor to be able to talk about the book here. But James and I started the book a couple years before I decided to run for Senate, is the short answer. And the motivation for the book was a belief that America was slipping away. It was in decline. Economically, from a national security perspective, spiritually, America was losing its way. And 80% of Americans agree that America is going in the wrong direction. And so we started to think about that question, what to do. And decline's not inevitable, but neither is renewal. It depends on what we do. And so we thought about it and decided to write a what to do book about what to do to bring back America and renew America. And it's a very ominous color, a very ominous cover, because we are at a really challenging inflection point. But as I think Roger would agree, it's a very optimistic book because there's a path ahead.
Well, I want to talk about that path ahead, but first we're going to deal with the ominous, pessimistic beginning because we need to understand it. And you begin the book actually talking a little bit about your Senate run. And I'm curious, since you had your mind made up and you started the book before you ran for Senate, when you're out there in Pennsylvania, going across all those counties, speaking to all those people, did it reinforce your sense that Americans think that we're in decline?
You know, it really did. So I was a CEO of Bridgewater. As Roger said, I resigned from that to run for the Senate in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a wonderfully diverse state. It's a lot like America. So you have very rural, conservative parts of Pennsylvania where I grew up, and you have urban areas and less conservative suburbs, still Republican. And so it's a very amalgamation of lots of things. And the thing that struck me, I have a pickup truck. I have a family farm, the pickup truck, and I drove 30,000 miles in 5 months. And the thing that struck me most was the anger. People were so angry. I couldn't really get over it until I started to spend time in diners and VFWs and fire halls. And they're angry because the last 20 years have not been good for them. They've not been good for them. So we have a 40-year high in inflation. We have record high debt. We have a fentanyl crisis in Pennsylvania, which is killing communities. We lost 5,000 people in Pennsylvania last year. We have record high fuel prices. We have crime in our cities, and we have the looming threat of China. And if you held assets in the last 20 years, if you had a house or money in the bank, you got a lot richer. But if you were living month to month, you didn't get rich at all. Real income stayed flat. And by the way, most Americans don't have assets. The majority live month to month. Something like 67% live month to month. And so that anger, and then by the way, there's been 20 years of war, which has drawn disproportionately from those working class communities, working class families. So they're angry because the American dream that many of us have been blessed to live has not been available to them. And they don't believe their kids are going to be as well off as they are, which is kind of my definition in one sentence of the American dream. You believe your kids have the opportunity to be better off. And so that was the thing that struck me. And they're deeply worried about the direction of the country. And that was a further motivation to, boy, I wanted to win that Senate campaign, obviously, but once I didn't win that Senate campaign, I said, I want to finish this book because everything I saw on the campaign trail really reinforced it.
Well, here at the Reagan Foundation, we know it takes time. For example, Barry Goldwater ran for president in 1964, but he wasn't elected in 1980. The way that people think about it in terms of Reagan given his time for choosing speech and those ideas playing out a decade plus later. One of the elements of the book is your biography, how it folds into this story, which has many policy prescriptions and addresses these issues of decline. And you go back to your childhood, actually, and you look back at Jimmy Carter and what you characterize as the crisis in American confidence. Talk about why you look back to that moment in the late 70s when Jimmy Carter's president, and then, of course, the namesake of this library, in terms of what Reagan did and how that kind of impacted your thinking and policy prescriptions.
Yeah, well, the experience Roger refers to, so I've had two renewal experiences in my life. One of them was coming back from the Army. I went to Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, had sort of been driven by steel and industrial, and had gone through a really rough period, but was starting to come out of it in the 90s. And I ran a technology company that was part of that renewal. But the thing that really gave me optimism and hope when I started to think about our current moment was growing up in the 70s. And I remember, like it was yesterday, like 1978, 79, I was 14, 15. And it was stagflation. Remember, it was like double. It was 15%, 16% inflation. The economy was in recession. We had fuel prices that were going through the roof. You remember odd days and even days? Okay, odd days and even days. So I remember, who remembers the Country Squire? That station wagon with wood sides that was like, my dad had the Country Squire. We'd go wait in line for gas. And there was Desert One, where Jimmy Carter sent the military in to try to rescue the hostages. We lost 8 service members on the sands of Iran. Reminds me a lot of Afghanistan more recently. And 80% of Americans thought the country was heading the wrong direction. 1978, 79, in my hometown, McGee Carpet Mill laid off a bunch of folks. That was a main employer in town. 1983, 4 years later, I'm a plebe at West Point. And I'm walking down that beautiful pathway in West Point, the Hudson River in front of you, those beautiful mountains. America's back. 4 years later, America's back. The economy's on fire, inflation's in check. We're investing in the military. You could feel the pride, the confidence. 6 years later, the Cold War ends. 4 years. And I'm not just saying this because I'm at the Reagan Library. Ronald Reagan and leadership, more important, leadership, changed the direction of our country. And I talk a lot about that in the book because it's kind of a leadership book as much as a policy book, because leadership is the difference between decline and renewal. And while the exact same solutions that Ronald Reagan proposed aren't the right solutions necessarily for this moment, the kind of leadership that Reagan provided is what we need for this moment. And that's one of the reasons it's an optimistic book, because that's the American story. We get to the edge of the cliff, we pull ourselves back. And I lived through one of those, and many of you did too, and so it gives you confidence that we can do it again.
Let's talk about the second moment you were referencing before, where you were born in Pittsburgh, then moved elsewhere in Pennsylvania, but come back, and you were in Pittsburgh, where Pittsburgh transformed. And there you kind of get into some of the themes that I think are relevant to the policy prescriptions in the latter half of your book, in terms of what were the elements that made Pittsburgh, which was this kind of suffering and post-industrial town that lost all the jobs, to now was a center, kind of emerging hub of innovation and success. And you were part of that with the company that you ultimately ran.
Yeah, well, if you look at American history and economic growth and vitality, productivity has been a key driver. So the way that America has continued to be economically viable, the reason the American dream has continued to be the promise that's delivered is we keep innovating. And so Pittsburgh was in this transition. And when I got there in 96. And so it had made real progress changing the economy from the steel industry, but it was still struggling. And I talk about that transition, that renewal, by describing the runs I would take on weekends.
Yeah, your jogs are on your right.
So I lived in the east end of Pittsburgh, and I'd run up in Schenley Park, and you could look down on the Monongahela, and you'd see the old, where the steel mills were, the remnants of the steel mills. And then I'd go up through Oakland, and you go past University of Pittsburgh, which is now a life sciences center, and Carnegie Mellon University, where you have huge government R&D, which has been a driver of robotics and artificial intelligence and all those things, and that's created tech workers that have driven a new economy in Pittsburgh. And then I go up through the Hill District, and anybody remember Hill Street Blues? Well, Hill Street Blues was in the Hill District, and that's a part of Pittsburgh that's sort of been left behind. And the transition that's happening in Pittsburgh is the transition that needs to happen in America. And I talk about the things that need to happen in terms of educating our people, in terms of investing in research and development, in terms of technology leadership, in terms of data, which is really the argument I make for innovation now. And if you're going to argue what the book is in one sentence, the book is essentially, to renew our country, we need to educate our people, we need to confront China, and we need to secure America. And the book is organized around those themes and the policies to do it.
Now, one of the things that come out of that experience, and then when you go into government during the Bush administration, is kind of the pieces of the economy that were left behind. I mean, you just talked about data and technology, but the manufacturing piece really didn't get replaced. It actually went overseas, and that was something that you saw both in the private sector, in government, and you emphasize that in a number of places in the book. What about that workforce? What did you kind of observe in terms of how we lost that element of our economy, and then your thinking in terms of what it takes to get it back?
Well, sort of looking back, what's happened, and I try to wrestle with this as someone who's been a conservative my whole life, and so not my whole life, but once I started to think about things after the Army, I would say I was pretty agnostic when I was in the Army, kind of like George Marshall. He didn't really have a pick a party. But the thing that I always believed was small government, capitalism, free markets. Those would be good things for American economy. Therefore, they'd be good for America's role in the world and America's strength. And when you get into these communities, you realize, well, wait a second, there's another side to the story. That it hasn't been so great for them in all the ways that I was just describing earlier. And so I try to wrestle with, okay, how does it make sense? Because if you pursue that free market orthodoxy, where are we today? Well, if you think about our pharmaceutical supply chains, which we all learned during COVID, they're dependent on China. I actually didn't know that until we went through COVID. Can you believe that our pharmaceutical supply chains are dependent? And then you say, well, semiconductors, they're like the thing that makes everything work. Like the reason you can't get a new pickup in Pennsylvania is because the semiconductors supply is limited. 90% of the semiconductors in the world that we need are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China. China has built 30 new fabs last year. We haven't built any. How could that make sense, right? And so you start to think about, wait a second, maybe we've been sleepwalking a little bit. And so what James and I try to do is we try to say, listen, we're conservatives. We're proud conservatives. Small government, capitalism, free markets drive good decisions, good allocation of capital. But the system's not working in certain places. So we need to adjust. We need to decouple strategically from China and bring certain industries home. That's good for our workers here at home, but it's also good for our national security. We need to do something a little different to make sure we lead in technology, because there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure we'll talk about, Roger, but 2 weeks ago or something like that, an Australian think tank just did an analysis.
I thought we were going to talk about the profile about you in the Wall Street Journal.
No, we're not talking about that.
Okay, that was on my mind.
So the 44 technologies that are most significant for economic growth and national security, this Australian think tank evaluated, China is in the lead of 37 of the 44. Now, how can that make sense? So what we tried to do was say, hey, listen, we're strong conservatives. We believe in the power of markets. We believe in small government. But here's places it's not working. Here's places where it's not delivering on the American dream. Here's places where we're vulnerable to China. And let's put forward an agenda that makes sense for all Americans. And so there's an area in there, if you're a strong conservative, you ask yourself the question, what would Milton Friedman think? And on economic policy. So there's a section there, for example, where we say, what would Milton Friedman think? And he wouldn't like some of the things we recommend.
Which you say, and you said he would agree with you if he knew the situation.
He might, because I don't think Milton Friedman would have had good answers to our current moment. And so, anyway, that's what the book is about. It's about saying, okay, we need to look forward. We need to renew America. And the old ways of thinking about things, we need to adjust. So we need leadership, we need to look forward, and we need a plan. And that's a lot like Ronald Reagan did in his day.
You mentioned China a couple of times. Let's focus on China, because that comes out throughout the book. And one of the things notable about your career, and you write about this, is that you were thinking and experiencing China before it kind of became the cool subject to discuss. Everybody nods their heads and says China's a problem. When you were dealing with China back in the Bush administration, perhaps before, but that's a recall from reading the book, you were seeing some of the trend lines, and you had a role in the Department of Commerce, perhaps you can talk about that, where you had the responsibility to figure out what should and should not go to China from a technology standpoint, perhaps other areas of trade that could be relevant to our national security. Others kind of joined in the chorus later on, but you were kind of going against the current back during the Bush 43 administration.
I was certainly wrestling with it. My first introduction to China was right after the Army, where I traveled for a year, or close to a year, and I ended up in China. I read this book, I was just by myself, I had a backpack, and I read this book called Riding the Iron Rooster by Paul Thoreau. And it was about him going through China on these old dilapidated trains. I said, I'm going to try that. And it was China was rural. Then you go into the main cities, there's just a few buildings, and a few skyscrapers rather. And I'd go running in the parks in the morning, and there'd be the elders out there doing Tai Chi. I would be the only Caucasian person. I mean, I was like a, I was like a celebrity. Everybody stopped and looked at me because I was an American running through the park. And I went back 15 years later as the Undersecretary of Commerce, and it was dramatically different. We came in on a government plane, and we go into Beijing, 10 lanes, and there's skyscrapers everywhere, cranes everywhere. And the question before us was how to make sure as China grew and developed that it would be in a way that was advantageous to the United States. And my job was to monitor the technology that was being shared with China, exported as part of our industry, because everybody wanted access to China's markets. And then I had a job in the Treasury where I was dealing with the financial piece. And two things became apparent almost immediately. One, that China really wanted a lot of our technology and was stealing a lot of it. There were a huge theft of intellectual property.
So you were seeing that back?
Absolutely. It was a huge, I gave speeches on it. I wrote articles on it in the newspaper. There was a huge intellectual property theft. But there was also, it wasn't illegal necessarily, but they would have industries come there and they would essentially take the technology on site, and that would be the beginning of their own indigenous industry. And then they put huge state support behind it. And so overnight, China has become, in a matter of a few decades, a technology juggernaut with this techno-authoritarian model. The second thing that was clear almost from the beginning is it wasn't reciprocal. And this is where I give President Trump a lot of credit, because the deal wasn't fair. In other words, U.S. markets would be open to Chinese companies, but Chinese markets wouldn't be open to U.S. companies. And all of this became apparent over time, where the U.S. interest and China's interest diverged. And then President Xi came on the scene in 2014 and went like this, because President Xi had a much more aggressive view of displacing America as the global superpower. And so when I talk about the superpower being in peril, it's in peril from within because we're losing sight of the American dream, and it's in peril from the outside because we have a unique challenger that in many ways is far more formidable than the USSR was during the height of the Cold War.
Because they have the economic power that the Soviet Union never reached. Let me follow up on President Trump there. Your book, you kind of have a complicated relationship with President Trump. On the China piece that you just acknowledged, he got it right. What else would you have done besides what President Trump put in place, which of course tariffs were a primary kind of policy tool he employed? The national security challenge he emphasized, and do you see that being sustained today?
I think what President Trump started to do was turn the ship, and we started to talk about China not as a competitor but as an adversary, which is what it was. And we started to talk about China challenging America on every front with its alliances around the world. By the way, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that China has partnered with Russia, as an example, right? That's not accidental. That's a very intentional thing. So diplomatically, economically, militarily, technologically, China is challenging America for leadership on every front. And we need to have a whole of nation strategy for dealing with it. And President Trump started to turn things. We haven't had that under President Biden. And so that's what the book argues for. And I essentially say we should do four things. We should strategically decouple. So we need to think about the industries where we just simply can't be dependent on China, or probably anybody, but certainly not China, maybe some of our closest allies. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, telecommunications, satellites, pharmaceuticals. These are obvious things. We need to bring those things home. The second thing we need to do is hold China accountable for bad behavior. and call out bad behavior. Let me give you a couple examples. There's the human rights abuses which we're tiptoeing around, and we need to call those out. There's COVID. So this is baffling to me, but it seems pretty obvious that if you had COVID originating in Wuhan, where there's a lab that studies such things like COVID, that there might be a connection between those two things. And to get to the bottom of it, and also to make sure you have vaccines and everything else, you need to cooperate. That's not happened at all. There's been no transparency. We haven't had any engagement from China on COVID, and yet it's been a cost of trillions of dollars and millions of lives to the world. That's a problem. We need to hold China accountable for that. The third thing we need to do, as I say this, I'm here in California, is we need to stop having companies invest in China in ways that directly supports the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese military, the PLA. So in the Silicon Valley, to this very day, there are firms investing in artificial intelligence companies in China that do business with the Chinese military. It's exactly counter to our interest. And so we need to have a review process in place that reviews outbound investment to China and doesn't let companies do stupid things. They should know not to do that anyway, but let's put clear parameters and clear roadmap. And the fourth thing we need to do is we need allies. We need allies who we work in concert. We have common interests, Japan and Australia and many, many others. But I say those because they're in the Pacific. And we need to have rich partnerships that advance our common interest. And that's the path. And so that's the argument I make in the book. And I think in dealing with China, we need to be first and foremost strong. So we need to have that way of engaging with China, but then we need to go to the gym at home. So the book is an agenda for going to the gym. So what are we doing? We got to fix our education process. We need to get our kids learning about how exceptional America is, not that America is a nation conceived in evil. We need to teach an honest reckoning of American history. We need to fix our teachers' unions. By fix, I mean get rid of them. We need to get skilled training for our workforce. We need to build up our military. We need to fix big tech. So there's a whole agenda of things that we need to do, which is under the direction of muscle building, right? We need to build muscle at home, and all of that's necessary to renew the American dream.
One piece, we go back to your China set of policies. I think the third one was talking about investment in China and the economic relationship. You know, this is personal for you, and when you left the Bush administration and you joined Bridgewater, huge investment hedge fund, number of their investments were in China. And you write about how you kind of wrestled with this. Even the founder and you had perhaps two divergent views. How did your time looking and working on this issue kind of shape your thinking about, can we really, as you use this word, decouple, separate between the United States and China as it comes to this economic interaction and interdependence?
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question because it's very difficult to decouple from China completely. And so that's not what I'm arguing in the book. I'm arguing that we need to change our economic relationship with China in a way that's much more in favor and advantageous to America, much more in line with our interests. But you have the two biggest economies in the world. And we're very entangled in many ways, both what we would do directly, but also what we do through common trading partners. So I think there are some that are arguing we should completely sever any economic. We didn't even do that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm making the argument that we need to be very incisive about how we approach this, very thoughtful and comprehensive. And Bridgewater is the firm that Roger mentions. I was the CEO of that for a number of years, and we had about 2% of our assets in China. We managed $160 billion, and we had, I don't know, $4 or $5 billion that we managed or invested in China.
I'd take 2%. That sounds like a lot to me.
That's a lot. And people would ask that on the campaign trail, and it became an issue on the campaign trail, and I would just try to describe it. It's the benefit of a book, because a campaign you get 30 seconds, a book you get a little bit more if people read it. But 30% of most of your homes have products from China. So in other words, if you go to your home right now, 30% of the products in your home will be made in China. So we are deeply entangled. And so now the question is, how do we deal with the risk to our economic well-being and our national security? And I think to do that, you need people that actually know something about national security, know something about economic policy, have actually run businesses. And so when I was on the campaign trail, and in the book, I present myself as someone who actually knows a little bit about this, and here's a plan that I think could serve America well, and we need to move forward on it.
You have a really great anecdote. Maybe it's a good point to transition the conversation to the military, your service in the Army, where you're getting some pushback from voters in Pennsylvania exactly on this subject. You know, you're kind of CEO, are a CEO of a big, financial outfit. What are you doing here in Pennsylvania? You know, how can you talk to kind of the blue collar worker, and then you start talking about football and West Point, and all of a sudden there's a connection, and you transcend it, and that, if I recall from the book, gets a discussion about our institutions, and how we need to restore institutions in this country, kind of like the way the military is a revered institution, and that kind of is a pathway to unity and strengthening the country, which is another one of the key pillars in your book.
We have so much in common.
So now that I totally ruined that story, you can
I'll tell it
and say what it was like.
So, de Tocqueville traveled across all of America, and the thing he talked about were these institutions, whether it were these little community centers, the fire halls, the churches, that they bind us. They bind us together. And I talk a lot about sports and growing up in Pennsylvania playing sports, wrestling and playing football. But the story you're actually talking about, during the campaign, President Trump, I was running in the primary against Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, the television personality.
Nobody's heard of him. They don't watch him.
Never heard of him. You might have heard of this guy. And President Trump endorsed him. And then President Trump took some swipes at me. So the thing that Roger was talking about was there was a meeting, a Republican breakfast in Adams County, which is near Gettysburg. And so I drove to that one morning for this breakfast, and I had been to Gettysburg a number of times over the years. But the one time I went to Gettysburg, I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, and we would have these officer retreats where we'd go to a battlefield and walk the battlefield, and it would be a way to learn what we could have done, and we'd go through Civil War and battles and revolution.
Like a staff ride, right?
It's a staff ride. Yeah. But because we were a paratrooper unit, we would parachute in to the place we were going to do this thing. So we had arranged for a farmer's field in Gettysburg where we would jump in, and I was, you can't tell who's who, so I coordinated that I would be the first one out of the door. So my mom and dad lived nearby. I said, Mom and Dad, here's where I'm going to be. So you'll see it's me when I jump out of the door. And so,
how did your mom feel about that?
Well, it gets worse because the farmer's field, the jump master gives me a slap. I jump out, and I'm over the field, and then the guy who's behind me jumps out, and I see his feet going across the top of my parachute, and my parachute collapses. And there's a few seconds, and then he bounces off, and he goes a different way, and my parachute redeploys. And I land, and I pick up my parachute, I run over to my mom and dad, and just both of them, tears. It's a disaster.
I couldn't tell from the book. Did they know what was going on?
Yes, they knew everything, because I was the first one out. So I tell that story at this very hostile group in Adams County, and it totally, everybody, warmed up. And they warmed up because everybody knows somebody in the military. And the military, at least in that part of Pennsylvania, it's not always the case in Pennsylvania, but the military experience brings people together. That common experience, and I've said this many times, I was in the 82nd for almost 5 years. I had a white kid from rural Alabama. I had a black kid from Newark. I had a Puerto Rican platoon sergeant who was 35, and I was 22, and he seemed like he was 80, and he would try to keep me on track. And I never remember in any of those, I don't remember who was what. I don't even know if somebody was a Democrat or Republican. We were just in it together. We were a team in support of America and trying to be patriotic. And so those bonds, whether it's on football fields or whether it's in the military or whether it's through national service, are part of what's missing because we're becoming more and more fragmented. And I think social media and lots of other things are contributing to that. And while we can't send everybody to the military, I'm not proposing that, finding ways to create those common bonds, I think, are what's necessary for our Republican Party, but also for the country abroad. And I'm trying to make that point.
Yeah, and that seems to be a critical piece in terms of the renewal and the recipe to get there. You also talk about how Pennsylvania seems to have great quarterbacks. He didn't entirely persuade me on that one as a place, but it seems to be convenient for a football fan from Pennsylvania. One other piece here that deals with this renewal is the language you use to talk about, you're talking about data, and we have to be leading data, but you don't just say leading, you say we have to arrive at supremacy. That's like a Reagan word to me, because President Reagan, in the context of the Cold War, wanted supremacy economically, militarily. Tell us about why you choose the word supremacy and your optimism, your belief that this actually can be done.
Yeah, it's a good example of where the solutions in President Reagan's day are completely different than now. But the now is that data is a huge strategic advantage for who has it. There was an Economist cover or article last year that said data is the new oil.
Right.
It's not quite the new oil. It's strategic like that, but the difference between data is you can use it over and over again. And data is at the core of innovation. So if you think about what's happening, it's happening so fast that none of us can keep up with it. But data is being used, this most new thing with chatbot. Data is being used in ways that we would have never imagined years ago. And so who owns the data, who controls the data, who uses the data to pursue innovation will determine leadership economically, national security-wise, and so forth. And we don't have a plan for data, and China has a plan. And China has, because it's an authoritarian government, it has control of everybody's data. And so if you think about the COVID vaccine, for example, one of the reasons we were able to move so quickly on generating vaccines was because the pharmaceutical companies came together and shared their data. So data is a superpower. Data is necessary to be a superpower, and we don't have a plan. And so there's a chapter in here where I describe, and by the way, data can be dangerous.
Right.
Because we've lost our privacy of data. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I order a pair of sneakers online, and then for the next 3 weeks I get advertisements for also, it's eerie, right? Because there's a lot of people getting your data, selling your data, having access to your data, and God only knows what they're doing with it. So we need a combination of protections to make sure our personal data is our data. We need a series of guidelines to be able to draw our data together in our country and our allies to be able to use it to our advantage. And then we need to take care that social media, and this is one of those places where I'm very anti my normal conservative leanings, where I usually say less government better. On big tech, I say more government better. And the reason I say that is that I think big tech, in particular social media, is contributing to a lot of what's wrong in America these days. It's very one-sided. I think the evidence is pretty clear on that. It's compounding on a narrative that's giving people a misplaced sense of what's really going on. And it's really distorting and I think eroding our kids' sense of reality. And so I'm not for the government getting in the middle of deciding whose kid gets to look at TikTok. What I am in the favor of is the government putting more liability on the social media companies, because right now they're not held accountable at all. So there's a whole chapter on that. We need to think about data. I would go so far as to say that having a plan for data would be one of the top 3 most important things that the next president should think about.
And just one quick follow-up on that. Supremacy, why do you feel that the United States and our free society, open society, could actually outperform the Chinese where they can just do this command and control and what they're doing and just sucking up all the data whenever they can get without asking?
Well, it's a little bit like why I believe in capitalism versus state-owned enterprises. It's because just like I don't think the Chinese economy over time will allocate capital as well as we'll allocate capital in our system, and we'll get more innovation and more betterment for society because the private sector allocates capital, I feel the same way about data. So the way we need to have our data strategy is not to have top-down control of our data where we're directing, the government's directing what to do, but we need to have standards in place that the data is available for entrepreneurs and innovators in a way that advances our society and doesn't use it at the expense of people's privacy. And so our data structure has to be very different than theirs. They have an advantage because they have maximum control, but we have an advantage that left to our own devices, the American entrepreneurial spirit, its pursuit of liberty and all that will always out-innovate.
Right.
if given the
So
opportunity.
the system, we got to set it up so the system can actually allow us to
Exactly.
prevail. Want to talk about immigration. Big area of focus in terms of the renewal, part of the battle plan here is talent. That our economy really needs to benefit from talent. Part of the education policies you referenced before, but part of it is bringing in talent from across the world to help us achieve these objectives. Immigration is broken in the United States. Illegal immigration, of course, is something that Republicans and the Congress right now are most concerned about. Voters are concerned about. And then you're talking about, okay, legal immigration. How do you balance that, and what piece does immigration have in terms of this priority for talent?
Well, it's a very controversial issue, as all of you know, and I really invested a lot of time into the second part of it during the campaign. I had my views on legal immigration and some of the things that need to change. Those have become more informed by running for office, but the thing that became much more informed was the impact of illegal immigration. And I think it's a mistake for those who say, well, we got to fix that illegal immigration problem, but let's get to this skilled immigration thing, and we'll fix. As a political matter, that's not possible, but as a matter for our society, I don't think it's appropriate either, because
And you saw that on the campaign trail?
I saw it on the campaign trail because I went to the border. I went to the border and I saw the border. I did with the Border Patrol. The president of the Border Patrol took me along the border. I talked to farmers. I talked to business people. I talked to the Border Patrol. Like, I saw it. I talked to the local sheriff in Yuma. I mean, I saw this for myself.
This is the Pennsylvania-New York border. You wanted to make sure those New Yorkers didn't get into Pennsylvania.
No, no, close. And it's a good question. Why would a guy running for Senate in Pennsylvania go to the border? And the answer was, well, first of all, everybody kept talking to me about it. Everywhere I went, people would say the border. And I would say, why do you care about the border? Well, fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis, which is a huge, debilitating thing to our economy, starts at the border, because what's happening is the Chinese are manufacturing fentanyl. Much of it's now manufactured in Mexico, and it's coming across the border through the cartels. And the more porous the border is, the more the fentanyl comes across. And it takes about 2 days from the fentanyl to cross the border and make its way to New York, Pennsylvania, and so forth. Route 80 goes right through the town where I grew up, and it's a big deal, 5,000 people. And I would go into every little town, and I'd say, how many people here had somebody in their family or friend group that was affected by fentanyl? You'd always get a bunch of hands. And the 5,000 are just people that died. Those aren't the people that are addicted and all the other stuff. So it is a big deal. So we've got to, in a very forceful and thoughtful way, stop that. It's bad economically. It's bad for all sorts of other reasons in terms of what it's doing for by the way, the human exploitation that's taking place, it's terrible. I literally sat there on one side of the border, looked across the Rio Grande, and you could see the cartel guys up in the bushes sending people across. It is beyond anything. So this is not a guy that I'm saying, watch this on the news. I went and saw it, so I'm speaking with some credibility. But you have to stop that in a way that is clear and appropriate, and then you have to also recognize the fact.
No, Guy, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to follow up on that.
Yeah, you have to recognize the fact that immigration is also a core part of our democracy, a core part of our society. It's what, the fact that our country is a nation of immigrants. My wife is an immigrant from a Coptic Christian from Egypt, and her family was persecuted, and their religion was persecuted. She came to Texas so she could practice her Christian faith. I mean, it's what makes America great and the vibrancy of America. So now, how do you do that when so many people want to get into America and you can't have all the people that want to get into America legally come in? And so I think there needs to be real reforms on our immigration system to have a more merit-based, merit in the sense of certain types of expertise, certain types of skills, and think about it holistically in terms of the areas that we need people to support our economy, and also people that are refugees and so forth. So we have to think holistically about it, but we don't have that today. And so we need to do a real reform of our immigration system, legal immigration, lean it more towards the skills that we need that won't be displacing American workers, by the way. That's the argument you hear on the campaign trail. If you let people in, they're displacing American workers. I don't really think that I think we can have a reform of our immigration system that actually fills the skills areas that we need, and there are big gaps. I saw that all the time on the campaign trail. At the same time, you can't even have that conversation until you decisively decisively close off the open borders, and I think that both need to happen.
I want to talk about what decisively means, and I'm going to bring in President Trump on that in a second, but I know you went on the tour today. On this point, I don't know if you noticed, but outside where President Reagan's office was in this library, you have paintings. I forget the name of the artist. I'm sure somebody here knows of images of immigrants come through Ellis Island and kind of going through the front door, and obviously something that President Reagan celebrated and thought contributed to the beauty and great heritage of this country. But in terms of illegal immigration, there's a reporting, I think it was in Mark Esper, former Secretary of Defense for President Trump, that President Trump contemplated taking military action in Mexico against the cartels. This is beyond the purview of your book, but you are a national security expert, so I want to get your take on it. Now you raise it. And then Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr, recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal also saying that we need to consider using military action to deal with the cartels. This is beyond simply building walls or getting immigration reform. This is saying this is a national security threat to our country. I'm curious, how do you respond when you hear about what President Trump is contemplating or Bill Barr is advocating today?
Well, I'm sympathetic to taking a much more aggressive posture on the cartels. I think they pose a really serious risk. I've seen it firsthand. I think there's enormous amount of evidence. There is a precedent with Colombia,
Yep.
and U.S. forces being used to combat the drug war in Colombia in concert with the Colombian government. There's posse comitatus, which puts very clear limits on using the military for domestic things. So it has to be done carefully, but I think it's a national crisis, and I think that taking decisive action is a necessary part of solving the problem, and the right policies, obviously. And I differ greatly with the way President Biden has approached it. So I think there's a policy change, but there's also, I think a lot of serious people are debating how we can best use the military to stop what is a really dangerous assault on America.
I mean, amazing, shocking. 2 days from the time it crosses the border, it can get into state like Pennsylvania. In a few minutes, we'll go to questions from the audience. But I would love for you to comment. You begin your book, and it surprised me, reflecting on the campaign and Donald Trump's role in the campaign. And you tell a story of how you really had an opportunity to win. And President Trump hadn't endorsed anyone at the time, and you heard he might be endorsing your opponent, and you have a conversation with him. One, why did you include that in this book? I guess inquiring minds wanted to know. I certainly found it provocative. I was turning the pages, interested in it. But two, more broadly, what did that teach you and kind of your relationship with President Trump and how it all finished up with your Senate run in terms of where the Republican Party is today and what the Republican Party needs to do to win and get back majorities in the Congress and ultimately get the White House back?
Well, the story you're referring to is I was a newcomer to politics. I'd never run for office before, and I came into the race very late because we had some health issues in our family. But when I came in, I got off to a good start, and Dr. Oz was one of the obviously one of the other opponents. But I started to go up in the polls, and I was winning in the polls pretty substantially by maybe eight or 10 points or something like that. And there was always been the notion that President Trump was going to endorse Mehmet Oz because they had known each other and they had houses in Florida together and so forth. But I was hoping that President Trump would stay on the sidelines. And I knew President Trump. He had asked me to be Deputy Defense Secretary when he had become president, and I knew him for a number of reasons. And so I called and asked if I could come see him at Mar-a-Lago, and I went, and he said yes. And I went down and I talked to him in his office, and he was disappointed that there was a couple things I had said when after January 6th and after the election about polarization. I had said, the interviewer had asked me whether I thought President Trump had contributed to the polarization of the country. I said, as a leader, I thought he had contributed to it. And then President Trump told me he thought I couldn't win.
He had the videotape.
Yeah, he had the videotape. No, he put up the videotape. Yeah.
He was ready.
And he told me he didn't think I could win unless I said the 2020 election was stolen. And I said I couldn't say that. I said I couldn't say that. And so I left, and the next 2 days later, he endorsed Dr. Oz. But then I was still winning in the polls, and then about 10 days out, he came to Pennsylvania, and there was he did a rally where he was pretty tough against me. Sort of
You were at that same area, right?
I was in the same area. I was in my pickup truck coming back from an event, and I turned on the radio, and I'm driving along, and all of a sudden
raining.
I hear,
You had a great story.
It's like the
muddy,
trees
dark.
are going by. I'm in the pickup going back to Pittsburgh, and I hear you. Dr. Oz is running against the Wall Street globalists. I'm like, uh-oh, this is a surprise. So anyway, that ultimately became a very close race. It tightened at the end, and Mehmet Oz won by 900 points. Now, that story is
900 votes.
900 votes, rather.
Yeah.
And the reason that story was important is a couple reasons I started with it. It reflects, I think, the debate within the Republican Party about the future of the country and the populist pulse that we have and the reconciliation with traditional conservative policies and principles. And I think it's a good debate because, as I tried to convey here, I think the people that say the system's not working are right. Like, there's a lot to argue about. And so what I try to do in this book, Superpower and Peril, is lay out an agenda that reflects, hey, the system's not working on a lot of different aspects. The traditional conservative, country club, lower taxes, small government, it's not working in certain areas. So we need to think about what this moment requires to deliver the American dream for everybody. So that's one of the things. And President Trump really uniquely channeled in 2016 that anger and frustration that the party, it wasn't working. It wasn't working for a lot of Americans. A lot of working Americans are not getting the America they were promised. And so that was one reason I talked about. The other reason was it came full circle at the end because then I was in a recount and I saw up close and personal how dysfunctional our electoral processes are, at least in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it was unbelievable. So there's 67 different counties. They all come in differently. I thought they told me I had won the night of the election, and then I didn't win the night of the election, but I was going to win in the recount. The Secretary of State told me there was 30,000 outstanding ballots. There were only 10,000. I was winning disproportionately in those. There were ballots that got lost in Philadelphia that then reappeared. And none of this, in my opinion, this was a Republican primary, so I don't think there was something grand. It was just dysfunctional. There's no voter ID required in Pennsylvania, so you could just show up and vote. So people are skeptical and losing trust. There's good reason to worry about our electoral system. I experienced it firsthand. And at the same time, I thought it was really important for me to look at the numbers and say, you know what? I think I lost this thing. And then concede and step up and say, hey, listen, I lost. And even with President Trump coming after me, I mean, when you lose by 900 votes, there's like 100 things you could have done differently. And so I accept responsibility. There's a lot of things I could have done and won that thing. And but we need to fix the uncertainty in our electoral. People need to have confidence. And so what do we need to do to win as Republicans? And to your final question, I think we need to look forward. I think we need leaders who look forward and lead the country forward. I don't think we can win looking backwards. I don't think we can win on grievance. I think we need to win on solutions and ideas. I think we need to be tough and call out and hold accountable. If you believe like I do that the progressives are taking the country in the wrong direction, you have to call that out and say, hey, this is a problem, this is not working. But you mostly have to look forward with solutions that solve inflation and solve fentanyl and solve the threat from China. And I think if we have good, and that's what I'm trying to do here, good solutions, good plans, good leaders, we're going to win elections and we're going to take the country in the right direction. And that's
good.
That's the spirit of
Good.
this.
That's a good theme there. Questions from the audience here? We ask that you just wait for the microphone. This gentleman over here in the white.
Thank you. You going to hold it? Okay. I haven't read your book yet, but it's being delivered to my home as we speak.
All right. Thank you.
And so perhaps your book covers this. The United States trades with its adversaries more than any country in the world. Do you think if the United States became more isolationist and restricted trade, that the U.S. economy could support itself? In other words, would consumers be demanding enough to keep U.S. citizens employed?
I think, if I'm understanding your question, I think that one of the benefits of our economy is the fact that we're an open economy that's engaging around the world. I think that is better for consumers, it's better for workers, in the sense that, you know, the good workers in York, Pennsylvania who make Harley Davidsons can export those Harley Davidsons around the world, and that creates jobs.
Even in China, to his question.
Even in China, to his question.
Yeah.
And I think that's, on balance, good for America, good for jobs at home. I think the thing I'm trying to say in the book is the free trade orthodoxy that says open markets, trade, 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 without putting appropriate constraints on it is misguided. And there's two constraints I'd say, I'll be real quick. One is reciprocity. We shouldn't trade with people where we're open to them and they're not open to us. And I think that's the concept that President Trump came back to, and he was right in my opinion.
I just think some of these adversaries need to earn the right
I agree with that.
to trade with us.
Yeah, that may well be the case. China certainly lost the right to trade in lots of areas. I believe you're right, sir.
Let's get one more question. Gentleman over here in the black, please wait for the microphone.
Just following up on your comment about we need to look forward, with all the possible presidential candidates coming up, who would you think would put forward a platform that more closely aligns with what you're espousing?
You know, I honestly don't know. I'm excited that we'll have a great primary. There's, you know, obviously a couple people in now, but I think more will come in. I know a number of those prospective candidates. I think they're extreme, and the existing candidates, I think they're super talented, lots of great experience. Just think about our field of candidates, possible candidates on the Republican side versus the Democratic side. I think we're blessed. And I think this is a moment for a great debate. And I hope we'll see something forward-looking emerge. I selfishly think this is a good plan, but you know, obviously others will have their views. But that's what I think is required. And you know, it's academic to say that, but I felt it in my heart on the campaign trail, where people are like, "Man, we need to look forward, and we need answers." And so we'll see who it is, but I'm hopeful.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dave McCormick.
Thank you.
And congratulating
Thank you for
him
being
on
here.
his great book, Superpower and Peril.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats as our VIP guest exits the room.